page 70. Life Against Death, Norman Oliver Brown, 1959. The Psychoanalytical Meaning of History. Part 2. Eros. Freud's two instincts, Eros and death, are fundamental hypotheses as to the general character of the repressed forces inherent in human nature by virtue of its connection with the body. Though repressed and unrecognized, these are the energies which create human culture, and to recognize their existence is to reinterpret human culture. Human culture is then reconnected with the human body. Eros creates culture, and Eros is the bodily sexual instinct. Chapter 3. Sexuality and Childhood. Part 1. As we saw in the first chapter, it is in our unconscious repressed desires that we shall find the essence of our being, the clue to our neurosis, as long as reality is repressive, and the clue to what we might become if reality ceased to repress. The results of Freud's exploration of the unconscious can be summarized into formulae. Our repressed desires are the desires we had, unrepressed, in childhood, and they are sexual desires. In analyzing neurotic symptoms and dreams, Freud found that they invariably contained a nucleus representing the return or regression to the experiences of early childhood. But, according to the whole hypothesis of repression, the consciousness which comes into conflict with the unconscious is the product of education. It follows that children are in some sense unrepressed. Or, to put it another way, in the child the conscious and the unconscious are not yet separated. It was therefore natural to infer that the adult, in flight from repressive reality and dreams and neurosis, regresses to his own childhood because it represents a period of happier days before repression took place. Furthermore, Freud found that the analysis of neurotic symptoms invariably led not only to the patient's childhood but also to his sexual life. The symptom is not merely a substitute for a pleasure denied by reality, but more specifically a substitute for sexual satisfaction denied by reality. But the repressed sexual desires whose presence was indicated were for the most part of the kind labeled abnormal or perverse. Thus the analysis of neurosis required the construction of a theory of sexuality which would account for perverted as well as normal sexuality and would trace both to their origins in childhood. The axiom on which Freud constructed this extension of his basic hypothesis is that the pattern of normal adult sexuality is not a natural, biological, necessity but a cultural phenomenon. The pattern of normal adult sexuality, the mutual love of man and woman and all the variations of the pattern, represents a particular organization of certain possibilities given in the human organism. This sexual organization is made possible by the social organization which marks the transition from ape to man, and simultaneously it makes that social organization possible. Man's sexual organization and his social organization are so deeply interconnected that we cannot say which came first, but can only assume a simultaneous evolution, whether sudden or gradual, of both. The critical institution in the transition from ape to man, the link between man's sexual and social organization, is parenthood, with the prolonged maintenance of children in a condition of helpless dependence. That parenthood implies family organization of some sort or another, and that family organization is the nucleus of all social organization, are anthropological axioms which Freud accepted and built into his structure. Freud's originality consists in drawing attention to the consequences of prolonged parenthood and prolonged infantile dependence on the sexual life of both parents and children. As far as the parents are concerned, it is clear that while adult sexuality serves the socially useful purpose of breeding children, it is for the individual in some sense an end in itself as a source of pleasure according to Freud, the highest pleasure. Adult sexuality, insofar as it is restricted by rules designed to maintain the institution of the family and insofar as the desire for sexual satisfaction is diverted and exploited for the purpose of maintaining a socially useful institution, is a clear instance of that subordination of the pleasure principle to the reality principle which is repression. As such, it is rejected by the unconscious essence of the human being and therefore leads to neurosis. Prolonged infancy has even more far-reaching consequences. On the one hand, infancy is protected from the harshness of reality by parental care. It represents a period of privileged irresponsibility and freedom from the domination of the reality principle. This privileged irresponsibility permits and promotes an early blossoming of the essential desires of the human being, without repression and under the sign of the pleasure principle. On the other hand, the infant's objective dependence on parental, especially maternal, care promotes a dependent attitude toward reality and inculcates a passive, dependent, need to be loved, which colors all subsequent interpersonal relationships. This psychological vulnerability is subsequently exploited to extract submission to social authority and to the reality principle in general. Thus prolonged infancy shapes human desires in two contradictory directions: on the one hand, on the subjective side, toward omnipotent indulgence and pleasure freed from the limitations of reality; on the other hand, on the objective side, toward powerless dependence on other people. The two tendencies come into conflict because the early experience of freedom and absorption in pleasure must succumb to the recognition of the reality principle, in a capitulation enforced by parental authority under the threat of loss of parental love. And since the pleasure principle is forced to capitulate against its will and for reasons which the child does not understand, under circumstances which reproduce its primal experiences of helpless dependence, anxiety, the capitulation can be accomplished only by repression. Hence it constitutes a trauma from which the individual never recovers psychologically. But in the unconscious the repressed dreams of omnipotent indulgence and pleasure persist, as the nucleus of man's universal neurosis and his restless discontent, the core irrequitum of St. Augustine. The infantile conflict between actual impotence and dreams of omnipotence is also the basic theme of the universal history of mankind. And in both conflicts, in the history of the individual and the history of the race, the stakes are the meaning of love. With his rude, persistent demand for the bodily origin of spiritual things, Freud starts not with love but with sexuality. But the man who discussed what he called the sexual life of children, and who insisted on the sexual character of thumb-sucking, must have had a special definition of sexuality. In fact, Freud's definition of the sexual instinct shows that he means something very general. It is the energy or desire with which the human being pursues pleasure, with the further specification that the pleasure sought is the pleasurable activity of an organ of the human body. He attributed the capacity of yielding such pleasure, an erotogenic quality, he calls it, to all parts of the surface of the human body and also to the internal organs. The organ in question may be the genital, or it may be the mouth, as in thumb-sucking, or it may be the eyes, as in the delight of seeing. If sex is so defined, there will surely be little disposition to deny that infants do have a sexual life, or even that sex in this sense is their chief aim. Infants are naturally absorbed in themselves and in their own bodies, they are in love with themselves. In Freudian terminology, their orientation is narcissistic. Infants are ignorant of the serious business of life, the reality principle, and therefore know no guide except the pleasure principle, making pleasurable activity of their own body their sole aim. And since childhood is a period of real immunity from the serious business of life, children are really in a position to obtain pleasure from the activity of their bodies to an extent which the adult is not. So Freud's definition of sexuality entails the proposition that infants have a richer sexual life than adults. If we grant that children pursue pleasurable activity of their bodies, we ask why this must be called sexual. The answer is that Freud is offering a genetic, historical explanation of adult sexuality, tracing it to its origin in childhood. On general grounds, Because of his general notion of the individual psyche as a historically evolving and historically determined organization, Freud could only reject the idea that the powerful adult sexual drive appeared suddenly from nowhere at the age of puberty. And the evidence of dreams and neurotic symptoms pointed unmistakably to the childhood origin of the repressed sexuality of the adult. Now, to say that the infantile pattern of seeking pleasurable activity of the body is sexual is equivalent to saying that this is the infantile pattern which develops into adult sexuality. Freud then found that this hypothesis not only explained the prominence of sexual themes in the repressed unconscious, in dreams and symptoms, but also accounted for the adult sexual perversions, thus satisfying the basic desiderata for an adequate theory of sexuality. If normal adult sexuality is a pattern which has grown out of the infantile delight in the pleasurable activity of all parts of the human body, then what was originally a much wider capacity for pleasure in the body has been narrowed in range, concentrated on one particular, the genital, organ, and subordinated to a name derived not from the pleasure principle but from the reality principle, namely, propagation, in Freudian terminology, the genital function. Then the pattern of normal adult sexuality, in Freud's terminology, genital organization, is a tyranny of one component in infantile sexuality, a tyranny which suppresses some of the other components altogether and subordinates the rest to itself. We shall see later that genital organization is constructed not by the sexual instinct but by the death instinct, but the pattern of normal adult sexuality can exist only on condition that the discarded pattern of infantile sexuality continues to exist side by side with it, and in conflict with it, in the repressed unconscious. The discarded elements of infantile sexuality are, judged by the standard of normal adult sexuality, perverse. The adult sexual perversions, like normal adult sexuality, are well-organized tyrannies. They too represent an exaggerated concentration on one of the many erotic potentialities present in the human body, which are all actively explored in infancy. The manner of this tyranny, as well as the close connection between normal and perverted sexuality, is illustrated by the fact that various erotic activities, which are called perversions if they are pursued as substitutes for the normal sexual act, are called legitimate if they are subordinated as preliminaries to the normal sexual aim. Children, on the other hand, explore in indiscriminate and anarchistic fashion all the erotic potentialities of the human body. In Freudian terms, children are polymorphously perverse. But if infantile sexuality, judged by the standard of normal adult sexuality, is perverse, by the same token normal adult sexuality, judged by the standard of infantile sexuality, is an unnatural restriction of the erotic potentialities of the human body. Freud's notion of normal adult sexuality, genital organization, as an unnatural tyranny is so contrary to our usual way of thinking that it needs to be elaborated. We usually think of the pattern of normal adult sexuality as given by nature, as a biological necessity. In other words, we accept the subordination of sexual activity to the purpose of reproduction as a natural state of affairs. In what sense, then, does Freud call it unnatural? Is not subordination to the reproductive function characteristic of sexuality wherever it appears, not only in human beings but also in animals and even plants? Adult animals seem to have what Freud calls genital organization. Will Freud say that in their case genital organization is an unnatural tyranny? These objections take us to the root problem of the distinction between men and animals. Psychoanalysis must maintain that there is a qualitative distinction between men and animals, but the distinction is based on what is perhaps only a quantitative phenomenon, namely, the peculiar prolongation of infancy in the human species. In the case of man, the prolongation of infancy and the postponement of puberty give infantile sexuality a longer period in which to mature, and at the same time parental care shelters it from the reality principle. Under these conditions infantile sexuality achieves a full bloom to which there can be no parallel in other species of animals. Hence there is a conflict in the sexual life of man, as there is not in other animals. In man infantile sexuality is repressed and never outgrown repression, and consequently neurosis distinguishes man from the other animals. The result is that genital organization is a tyranny in man because his peculiar infancy has left him with a lifelong allegiance, that is, fixation, to the pattern of infantile sexuality. Thus Freud's theory of infantile sexuality is an essential part of his theory of neurosis, so that he puts this concept on the same level of importance as his concept of repression and the unconscious, and says that psychoanalysis stands or falls by the expansion of the idea of the sexual function as opposed to the narrower one of a genital function. The therapeutic value of the concept of infantile sexuality as an aid in the psychiatric treatment of those individuals whose neurosis has reached the point of incapacitating them for practical living is not the issue here. What matters is the flood of light which the concept of infantile sexuality throws on the universal neurosis of mankind and on his ultimate nature and destiny. In Freud's theory of infantile sexuality there is first of all a critique of the genital function and an implied rejection of genital intercourse, free love and the orgasm as a solution to the sexual problem. Not only is there an implied critique of D.H. Lawrence, there is an implied critique of superficial followers of Freud himself, and even some great ones, Abraham, Reich, Fenichel, who have idealized the genital character as a way out of the human neurosis. Thus Fenichel, the ability to obtain full satisfaction through genital orgasm makes the physiological regulation of sexuality possible and thus puts an end to the damming up of instinctual energies, with its unfortunate effects on the person's behavior. This appearance of finding the solution to the world's problems in the genital has done much to discredit psychoanalysis. Mankind, from history and from personal experience, knows better. How perilous the pitfalls are that lie on both sides of the psychoanalytical path can be seen in the sad career of Wilhelm Reich. A man with keen insight into the sociological implications of psychoanalysis, he foundered on the theory of infantile sexuality, as do the Neo-Freudians, and ended up in a glorification of the orgasm as the solution to all social and bodily ailments. Freud sees conflict in his earlier theory between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, in his later theory between Eros and Death in the genital act itself. He distinguishes fore-pleasure and end-pleasure in sexual intercourse. The fore-pleasure is the preliminary play with all parts of the body, and represents a perpetuation of the pure polymorphous perverse play of infantile sexuality. The end-pleasure in the orgasm is purely genital and post-pubertal. From the Freudian point of view, the subordination of fore-pleasure to end-pleasure in sexual intercourse is a compromise concealing a conflict between the desire of the immortal child in us for pure polymorphous play and the reality principle which imposes genital organization on us. This conflict explains the fact that while it is not true, as the Church Father said, that post-coitum animal trist, it is true of the human animal. The immortal child in us is frustrated, even in the sexual act, by the tyranny of genital organization. Hence the attempt to overthrow genital organization in certain practices of mysticism, being able, as Freud said, to grasp certain relations in the deeper layers of the ego and the id which would otherwise be inaccessible. The heretical Christian sect known as Adamites, who sought to recapture in this life the innocent eroticism of Adam before the fall, practiced coitus reservatus, intercourse without orgasm, that is to say, pure fore-pleasure. If he knew psychoanalysis, Needham would not be so puzzled that in Taoist mysticism coitus reservatus should have been considered so valuable for mental health. For Freud, the clue not only to normal adult sexuality but to our whole repressed and hidden ultimate essence lies in infantile sexuality. This is not a proposition to which we take kindly. Ignorance and fear, both of them the results of repression, together with the noble illusion, fostered by our higher aspirations, that we are all soul and no body, set in motion one or another of a number of mechanisms of intellectual flight whenever the topic of sexuality is taken seriously. If deference to the scientific attitude has induced a certain broad or open-mindedness toward the general topic, the specific details are more than we can take, and we slip into the evasion of abhorrence or amusement. We are likely to withdraw our willingness to listen when we are told that infantile sexuality is polymorphously perverse. And Freud must mean that polymorphous perversity is the pattern of our deepest desires. How can this proposition be taken seriously? Page 85.